All right, so maybe we can get started. I see more and more people are joining, and I think more of us will join throughout the talk as well. In the meantime, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Please feel free to add your questions in the chat or to raise your hand throughout the talk to ask anything. We're also going to have a Q&A at the end. And we're very excited to welcome Dr. Maria Rodriguez today with us. So I'm going to start the recording now. All right, so we're live now. And thank you so much, Dr. Rodriguez, for joining us today. This is the last MD4SG colloquium for this academic year, and we're very excited to hear you talk about your work. A little bit about Dr. Rodriguez. She's an assistant professor at University at Buffalo School of Social Work at SUNY. She's also a faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, a faculty fellow at the Center for Democracy and Technology, and a member of the Twitter Academic Research Advisory Board. Her research is at the intersection of applied demography, computational social science, and social policy. Dr. Rodriguez also founded CARED Lab, the first lab house in a school of social work dedicated to computational research methods in the public interest. And her lab works with technologists across fields of inquiry to leverage cutting-edge innovative technologies to develop, implement, and evaluate scaled interventions. So today, Dr. Rodriguez will talk about the limits of moral philosophy in dealing with algorithmic bias and the role of social work in doing so. So thank you so much, and please feel free to share your screen.
Thank you. Here we go. Hopefully you all can see that well. Excellent. So thanks so much for having me here today. It's a real privilege and pleasure. So what I want to do is walk through kind of how my talk will go. I'm going to start by offering some acknowledgements and a formal welcome, and then I'll give you a little snapshot of sort of my history, kind of the road that led me to thinking about algorithmic bias, AI broadly. I'm going to give you what I think is some concrete evidence about the root of algorithmic bias, and I'm going to give you some next steps in terms of thinking about why moral philosophy, at least as it's been applied thus far in social policy and specifically within the United States, might be short-sighted or limited. And I'm going to offer the philosophical foundations of social work that I think can offer some expansion on the limits to moral philosophy as it's being applied in algorithmic bias today. I acknowledge the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and I honor the sovereignty of the Six Nations, the Mohawk, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Seneca, and the Tuscarora. I live and work on their land here in Buffalo, New York, and I offer my thanks to them and their ancestors for the opportunity to do so. I also want to share with you my positionality because it informs what I'm sharing with you today. I identify as an Afro-Latina, cisgendered heterosexual woman. I also identify as the daughter of 2 generations of immigrants from the Dominican Republic. My ancestors are the Taino and Arawak people, West African people who were kidnapped and enslaved predominantly from Benin, Togo, and the Congo, and who recreated their home as best they could on the island then known as Haiti, and now known as Hispaniola, which houses the Dominican Republic and Haiti, as well as the colonizers who made their home on that island, the Spanish and the Portuguese, among others. So I give thanks to my ancestors for their guidance and their protection, and I ask them to accompany me on this talk today. And so with that, I want to formally welcome you to yet another Zoom talk. I hope that you can gather a warm or cool beverage and sort of settle in. I'm grateful for the technology that allows us to connect, even though it's remote. I want to further preface this talk by saying that my 5-year-old is approximately 10 feet away from me. And so I'll ask for your compassion in advance in case I get interrupted. And I'm also going to share with you that the content of this talk is You won't see any, graphs or very few citations. What I'm sharing with you is my understanding of what I believe to be the principal issue in algorithmic bias and what I think we should be doing about it and thinking about it. And so any errors that may come across are completely my own. And so here's sort of the context, the road that got me to have the opportunity to share space with you today. Ethical algorithmic decision making in human services is one of my primary research areas. And my current body of scholarly work is informed by just shy of 20 years experience in the field of human services, which is sort of listed briefly on the right hand of this slide. And on the left-hand side, you'll see some of the most recent publications around this area that I've been fortunate to be a part of over the last few years. And I want to further share with you that in the field of social work, both as a field of inquiry and as a field of practice, folks who are interested in pursuing a PhD are often advised and sometimes required to have at least 2 years post-MSW experience, meaning that they've been out in the field, professional work. And one of the reasons for that is as a result of our accreditation standards. So in order to teach bachelor's and master's level students social work practice, one has to have actual practice experience. But the second reason is because it aims to try to ensure that whatever research a doctoral student is engaged in, is planning to conduct, that research is based on some kind of contextual understanding of the issue. Although it may not necessarily be comprehensive, there's a kind of bodily experience associated with the issue that they're trying to address. And I think that's critical for what we're going to talk about today. So concretely, algorithmic bias has been defined in a few ways in the literature, and sort of every day it seems that there's a new sort of contentious debate about what really is bias, what's an algorithm, what is life, all of these kinds of questions. But one way that it's defined is as sort of systematic and repeatable errors in a computer system that create unfair outcomes. A second way is to think of it as outcomes that are systematically less favorable to individuals within a particular group, and where there's no real relevant difference between the groups that justifies that harm. And sort of broader definition is algorithmic bias amplifies inequities in society. And this graphic is sort of a depiction of that last conceptualization, right? The idea is that there's this mountain of really bad things that exist in the world, and algorithms really are just serving to perpetuate most of those bad things because our understanding is limited about the processes that actually undergird society to make it function the way that it actually does. And so rather than mitigate it, we've simply updated the bad stuff. So now it's, shiny and housed in really nice hardware. I actually think that the issue is a bit deeper. And I want to illustrate that with what I understand to be sort of the promises of AI. So I want to preface this by saying, if you don't know who Rosie from the Jetson is, then you're not as cool as you think you are. But those of you who maybe don't know, this is Rosie from a cartoon from when I was growing up with the Jetsons. And I think it's a really a great illustration for what we want from algorithms, right? For what we want from AI. We want AI to simplify our lives so that we can get to the real good stuff, right? So, as a personal example, I have 2 robot vacuums. I'm strongly considering a third. As soon as somebody figures out how to make a Rosie for less than like $2K, I'll really think about that hard before I throw my money at them. As soon as somebody figures out autonomous driving, I will also think hard before caving and throwing my money at them too. So this sentiment has really been expressed by quite a few people in the field. There's some books that you might be familiar with, The Power of Algorithms, The Power in Algorithmic Thinking. And the general sentiment is something like, algorithms are really just step-by-step methods for decision-making that are presumably more transparent because they're mathematical and therefore presumably logical. So, let's use algorithms to deal with those really tedious things in our lives. And then we can kind of get to living, right? That might be what we want from AI, but it's not actually what we need, right? And so this depiction is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is used quite often in social work training, because the point of this graphic and this framework is that in order to live our lives, we have to have some sort of basic standards to survival met before we can really start to extrapolate towards bigger things. The example of Rosie and the things we want from AI, those aren't basic needs. They're just really tedious middle class problems. And we think of them as needs, because we don't have to worry about where our next meal is coming from, or where we're going to live, where we're going to sleep tonight, how we're going to pay the rent, and so on. What's important about this graphic is that the bottom 4 tiers are understood as deficiency needs. And so deficiency needs arise as a result of deprivation, and they're said to motivate people when they are unmet. The motivation to fulfill these needs will become stronger the longer the duration that they're denied. So for example, the longer somebody goes without food, the hungrier they're going to be. And so AI in not just human services, but as applied to humans broadly, as developed by humans, should be channeled toward increasing our ability to intervene in these bottom 2 tiers, right? Physiological needs and safety needs, basic survival. Some of us might be thinking, well, isn't that kind of what we're doing? Isn't that what AI for social good is about? Trying to sort of address, homelessness or what have you. But I think if we spend time looking at the mission statements of organizations that call themselves doing AI for social good, we'll find that their missions are unclear, generally very broad. We'll find that their vision is also broad and unclear. In previous talks, I've shared mission statements from Google AI for social good, from some conferences that have sort of workshops around social good. And a lot of the basic questions that we need to understand those organizations are unmet. So for example, who's good? What is good? What would it mean to do AI for social good? Does that mean that everybody walks away with a house? Does that mean that everybody walks away with more money? Or does that mean that the people who develop the tool can feel good about, kind of throwing some crumbs in some direction, right? And so I think that this is this sentiment, this kind of nebulousness around the AI for social good kind of broadly, and certainly within that framework, how we address bias, right? What is bias? Are we sure we're being biased? Biased to whom? Why? Is it okay to be biased? Maybe we don't really want those people around. So what I'm going to describe next is what I think are the 3 predominant issues when it comes to algorithmic bias specifically, but broadly AI for social good. And the first of these is that the root of algorithmic bias, and indeed maybe the root of social problems, is that we built modern society for people at a very specific intersection of identities, and we quarantined everybody else. And that truth, that reality requires that we all agree in order to be able to move forward with any kind of good. And there might be some of us who aren't sure what I mean about a specific intersection of identity, so I'll be clear. What I mean is wealthy, Anglo-Saxon, cisgendered, male Protestant Christians, period. And in case some of us might disagree about that or might not be, it's okay if we disagree. But in case some of us aren't really sure what I'm referring to, um, I'm going to give you 3 examples from social policy or social service delivery in the United States from their origins to hopefully try to bring that home. So the first is the Orphan Trains, right? And the Orphan Trains were in operation between 1854 and 1929, and approximately 250,000 homeless children, generally from the East Coast, the large cities, New York City, Boston, etc., were taken from the street and placed in foster homes, generally in rural areas in the Midwest. And this came about because a person by the name of Charles Loring Brace, who was a New York City minister, he noticed that there was a problem of homeless children in around 1853. So he founded the Children's Aid Society, which is still in existence today, and began this work. And what's important is some of Brace's thinking and assumptions around the establishment of the orphan trains. He believed that street children would live better lives if they left poverty, the debauchery of living in the sort of urban environments, and were raised by, quote, morally upright farm families. What's important about that specific insight is that Brace was also recognized that there was a growing need for labor in the farm country that was expanding, right? He believed that farmers would welcome homeless children, take them into their homes and treat them as their own, especially because they were able to offer their labor in exchange for their lodging, right? What's important about this is that the orphan trains led to the establishment of what we now understand as foster care. So the punchline here is that the way that we dealt with children in need from its inception was to recognize that there was poverty and pick it up and put it somewhere else where we wouldn't see it, and where they could be invited, or some might say coerced, into exchanging their labor, assimilating into certain ideologies around spirituality and morality. For example, the establishment of social services in the United States can be traced back to the Elizabethan Poor Laws. And in that instance, poverty was understood to be a moral failing, right? You were a morally deficient person as a result of your poverty. The only reason you were poor was because you were morally deficient, not the other way around, or not any other kind of conflagration of ideas. And so that sentiment continues to this day, right? We still believe that we have to figure out who's deserving of help, right? Who deserves this, who deserves that. And the orphan trains are one example of how we did that with children. Importantly, this is similar, but a little bit different to the Native American re-education schools, also known as Native American boarding schools. And these were funded by the federal government as part of the Civilization Fund Act of 1819. And the idea here was that the running quote at the time was, save the man, kill the savage. Right. And so the idea is that the federal government would take Native children from their homes, from their tribes, from their land, and put them into these schools where they would be assimilated to Christian values, to sort of industrial capitalist values, and they would, in some cases forcibly be removed from their sort of home, their mother tongue, their homes, their mothers, their families. With this particular image is the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which is was located in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And I have a personal connection to this because my ex-husband's family is actually from Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and owns a farm there. And the first time I went, I realized where I was standing. And I'm not saying that that's related to why he's my ex-husband, but certainly it didn't help. Although it wasn't his fault, of course. So again, there's a real specific history here that ties social welfare and human services, specifically within the United States, and specifically in relation to children, to sort of attempting to change sort of collectivist survival strategies, collectivist ontologies and epistemologies, and shifting them to more capitalist, Christian, industrial ways of thinking. Again, attempting to move the margins into the mainstream by converting the margins into the mainstream. Two more examples. The next one is the slave patrol, which in the North, so in the South, slave patrols were sort of commissioned, certainly formally with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, and then reified in 1850 with the updating of that act. As the name suggests, the role of the slave patrol was to be on the lookout for runaway slaves that had escaped plantations, and to forcibly bring them back. What's important is that in the North, slave patrols were originally night watches. And the night watches' original sort of stated intention was to secure night activities. So, bars, sex workers, and so on. And with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, increasingly those night watches also became slave patrols, because there was money in returning escaped slaves that had come to the North back to the South. So again, what's important is that the Fugitive Slaves Acts made it legal and almost a requirement that any state or territory pertaining to the United States was actively in the business of returning fugitive slaves back to the plantations that they had escaped from in the South. We now know those patrols and night watches as police departments. The last bit that I want to share with you concerns housing and redlining, right? And so redlining was a federally sanctioned practice. You can find the text in the National Housing Act of 1934 that established a practice of ranking physical locations for credit risk. And so what's interesting, but probably not surprising, is that the more diverse an area was, then the riskier it was to extend credit in that area. And what you see here are various cities across the United States and the redlining maps from those cities on the right-hand side. What's important about this is that this wasn't a secret. It was part of property deeds. One of the most famous examples is Levittown, New York, which is part of Long Island. But certainly, if you were to Google restrictive covenants in your particular city, if you are within the United States, you would not be hard pressed to find examples where the specific clauses within property deeds prohibited the sale or purchase of such property to anyone who wasn't white. Another important anecdote, I think it was up until 1970, if not a little bit later, the great state of Oregon prohibited Black people from living in that state. So it was part of the state's constitution. And the state constitution, it said you can't be Black and live in Oregon. Interestingly, it's part of the reason why the sort of far right has a kind of a love affair with the Pacific Northwest, because there's a very specific history of exclusion in that area. What's important about these areas, these redlined areas, the areas that historically were prohibited from accessing the credit market, is that we know them now by actually a variety of names. So I think under the Clinton administration, if I'm not mistaken, they were called empowerment zones. Under Obama, they were promise zones. They've been known as renewal communities, enterprise communities. But to people like you and I, they might just be known as the hood or the ghetto. And today, actually, most specifically, there's that 5-year-old I was talking about. 1 second. Yes?
Can I watch that?
Yeah, you can. Oops.
Hold on. What kind of movie is that?
So what's important about, so today we know these areas as in danger of gentrification, right? That's how we talk about them today. What's important about all three of these areas, child welfare, policing, and housing, is that they were designed this way, right? It wasn't an accident. It wasn't that, people kind of, failed to do one thing or another. It was that specifically social policy specifically created these systems in this specific way. In the case of children, to sort of over surveil and ensure morality. In the case of policing, to ensure exclusion, and again, in the case of housing, ensuring exclusion as well. Oops, can't change my slide. There we go. So we should understand, therefore, that if we're using data that is tied to human services in any kind of way, whether we're talking about child welfare, health, housing, so on, we're using data that's been compiled to surveil and quarantine people on purpose, and we're asking that data to help us free them, right? That's my particular opinion about AI for social good as it stands today, right? And you might appreciate the paradox therein, right? We also are looking for ways to do the most good for the greatest number. And for those who might be familiar, this is related to the moral philosophy understood as sort of utilitarianism broadly defined, right? Which is the idea that whatever is, an action is right or just or fair in as far as it promotes happiness, and that the greatest happiness of the greatest number should be the guiding principle of conduct. What I hope I've established up to this point, interruption notwithstanding, is that all of these systems were designed for the benefit of a very specific group of people at a very specific intersection of identities. And so therefore doing the greatest good for the greatest number of people, by definition, excludes pretty much everybody else who happens to live in society. To me, that mode of operating, that mode of defining fairness, justice, and morality is not sustainable. And so this is where social good social work, comes in, which is when we're trying, folks who are interested in AI for social good, social workers might generally ask, well, are we talking about social good or are we talking about justice, right? And in social work, we think about the margins, the whole, for the most part. My own definition of social work is that it functions in society to mitigate market failure. So everyone that capitalist markets don't work for, social work catches. The problem today, and really since the inception of the profession, is that there's a whole lot of people to catch, right? And once you catch them, well, what do? Where do you put them, right? You can't put them in the market. You can't put them outside the market. Maybe you could put them kind of adjacent to the market. And so as the social work profession has developed, we've gotten our current ideas about social justice predominantly from redistributive justice from John Rawls, and specifically the difference principle, right? And so in particular, this second principle, the idea that social and economic inequalities should meet two conditions, that they should, one, be attached to positions and offices that are open to all under conditions of fair and equal opportunity, and that they should be to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. Importantly, social work hasn't necessarily got the lock on this particular notion of social justice either, but certainly as the center of our profession, as the center of our code of ethics, this is sort of where we start. So practically, or specifically, I should say, I want to talk a little bit about the philosophical foundations of social work and why I think that puts us in a different position, and I would argue a better position to offer solutions to not just algorithmic bias, but the conceptualization, implementation, and evaluation of AI for social good. And the first is perhaps a little known area of philosophy, which is American pragmatism, and the tradition of pragmatism that began in the United States. Jane Addams, who's considered to be sort of the founding founding mother of social work within the United States, certainly was known to be good friends with John Dewey and William James and corresponded often. A lot of her ideas around the settlement house movement were sort of exacerbated by her discussions with these folks, in particular when she considered the role that a settlement house, and if folks aren't familiar with the term settlement house, what I'm referring to is an organization of people who lived in a specific community, who were charged with living within that community and serving their neighbors, right? And they did there was all kinds of sort of programming associated with settlement housing or houses, things like childcare and job training, civics courses, et cetera, and so forth. But always sort of an undercurrent within social work is the idea that, well, we have to work with what we have, right? And so there's plenty of debate within the field, for example, of, well, do we just kind of burn all of human services down and just kind of start over again, or do we work within the system, right? This tension is endemic to social work. It's something that we struggle with often. And it comes from sort of our roots in pragmatism. The second foundation that also is maybe a little bit less talked about is the social gospel movement, which was a movement in the late 1800s, early 1900s that sought to sort of work within Christianity to reform Christianity to be more Christ-like in nature. And what I mean by that was there was a consensus that some of the changes that were happening at the time, remember we're talking about sort of the Industrial Revolution and kind of its after effects, there was a thinking at the time that that Christianity, that religion could do a lot more to help with the market failures that were occurring at the time. And so to be more Christ-like meant to be to spend more time with the poor, with the infirm, with the ill, with the outcasts, and to work to not only care for them, but also, again, seek ways to help them function within society. So whether that was being adjacent to the market or being at the bottom tier of the market and so on. An important sort of outgrowth of the social gospel movement, at least within the United States, was the Catholic worker movement, which was again sort of a reform movement within Catholicism, more specifically, that sought to sort of take in these principles from social gospel and try to turn the practice of Christianity within the United States as more of a market failure motivated endeavor. And we see this to this day, right? If we look at field placements for social work students, they're often in places like Catholic Charities, and so on, Lutheran Children Family Services, right? So the relationship still exists to this day. The third foundation I'll briefly mention is the ethics of care. And this is a sort of a feminist-based idea of justice, right? Where the idea is, the harmonious relations and the needs of others play an important role in ethical decision-making, right? So the way that we do work has to be rooted in the needs of folks, how to keep harmony and peace within them. And this is really in contrast to an ethics of justice, right? Which is more about, again, function and about fairness and morality. Maybe it's in social work, we talk quite a bit about the difference between equity and equality, right? And the idea is more to be in line with from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, which is of course a Marxist paradigm or saying as well. Not to say that social workers are Marxist, that we had a whole red purge in the 30s or in the 50s during the McCarthy era. We could talk about that later. But what's important about these three things is that they were all completely exclusionary. So social work, like everything else in America, is also racist and ethnocentric. And the efforts of communities of color at this time that were certainly concurrent to what was happening with mainstream social work are sort of under-theorized. One scholar to look at is Iris Carlton-Laney out of UNC Chapel Hill, who's done a lot of work around sort of how, who's done a lot of work around Black care, Black mothers, and Black work. Elias, could you lower that? Thank you. So the other important piece of this is that, well, actually, I'll say, just to reiterate that the work that Black women, Black femme women in particular, but Black women sort of broadly understood within the United States, specifically when it comes to care and to justice, has been not as well understood and not certainly not theorized, not chronicled, and is not a part and parcel of how social work occurs in the United States. This is important because there were these efforts still occurred. So we have benevolent associations, asociaciones, tandas in Latinx communities that we could be learning quite a bit from. The key to social work and its ethics is the person and environment framework. Right, all of those sort of foundations have led to this, which is maybe the thing we spend the most time thinking about in social work, and that is the understanding that individuals are not by themselves, nor have they ever been. That community and social societal factors are endemic to how people move in the world, and to ignore one is to ignore the person, right? So some of the operating theories here are Bronfenbrenner's ecological model, the biopsychosocial spiritual approach, micro, meso, macro, systems theory, and the strengths perspective, which, if you get nothing else from this talk, is the understanding that everyone is more than the worst thing that they have ever done. And every person is equipped to handle the challenges that are in front of them if we were to only pay attention to what they're bringing to the table rather than what they're missing. And so I'll end this by talking about some of the work that I'm currently doing that kind of highlights these things. So the first is my lab, the Carrot Lab, will be working on looking at sort of organic bystander interventions on social media, wherein there are racist sort of interactions. And this is directly in line with the strengths perspective, right? We understand that there's always resistance, right? And so there's people out there that while some of us, technologists are wringing our hands trying to figure out how we're going to solve racism on Twitter, for example. There's actually people that are already doing that work. And if we just look and give them credit for what they're doing, maybe we wouldn't have to work so hard. And then the second is child welfare policy and foster youth outcomes, where we're thinking about, myself and a team of computer scientists and engineers, we're thinking about, well, we already know what foster youth outcomes are given, sort of the history that I've given you and kind of what we understand about disparity. So why don't we look at the policy and kind of tie the outcomes to the policy, though, so that we can see how the rules are playing out in sort of what we're seeing. And then the third thing that I'm working on is myself and another a transdisciplinary group of folks, some of whom are in child welfare, in that child welfare project, is, I don't know if folks saw that a judge vacated the CDC's sort of evictions moratorium, I think 2 days ago, if not yesterday. And so there's a real understanding that there's going to be a whole lot of evictions and more, and foreclosures. Would we like to do something about it? And so myself and this team are saying, well, listen, like AI has given us a lot, machine learning has given us a lot. So why don't we apply some of these forecasting models and simulations and show you what's going to happen if you don't do anything by September? And that article will be under review in June. So with that, I want to thank you for your time. And open it up now for any questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Maria. This was really an amazing talk, and I think it's very inspiring for us to learn more about this work and about your work as well. There's one question that I see in the chat about are there books on the history of social work and how we can learn more about this?
Actually, Anna, I can jump in with my question. So yes, so definitely suggestions for sort of overview books would be very welcome, both social work more generally and child welfare specifically. But a more specific question I want to ask is that, so I'm not in social work, but I do work with some social workers, and I've been trying to learn about it over the past couple of years. And it's been really complicated because, let's say if you take the child welfare in the US, it's not necessarily a good system, right? It's not a good system, but it's also a system that we need, right? Like removing it entirely is also not a solution. And so a meta question I have for you is, if you're working within such a system that is obviously also just punitive in many ways, especially to marginalized communities, but also is needed, right? Because there are children that are in danger. How do you approach that, and how do you approach that responsibly, both as a social work researcher, but then as a researcher and individual more generally?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So two things. One is to understand the context of the data that you're looking at. You must understand that the data will always be predispositioned to finding things that aren't there, to over surveil by default. I don't care what system it is, but especially in child welfare. And so knowing that, you when you're looking to predict anything, the second thing I would say is recognize that if what you're trying to do is change the system, then thinking that the future will look like the past is counter to your aim. Methodologically speaking, that means I need you to engage in some kind of simulation, right? I need you to engage in some kind of imagining of the system you want to see, and then understand the gap between the predictions that are coming from the data and the simulations that you're hoping for. And in that space is where I think we can do the most good.
So just a follow-up question, assuming others don't have any, I'll stop talking right after this question. But so what you're saying actually about the data that we have is of the past, but what we're trying to do is forward-looking, is a really complicated one, right? Because if you're working with the child welfare, within the child welfare system, which I am a little bit now, you notice all the things that are wrong and you have a set of skills. So you're like, okay, maybe the thing that I can do here is to highlight the things that are wrong. I can show you, right? I can formulate my questions such that I can show you, for instance, that a lot of times the things that we label to be neglect are actually poverty, right? That's just straight up poverty. So why don't you just give people more money instead of like removing their kids and traumatizing everyone involved, right? And it's really hard, right? Because you end up in the situation where you've problematized something, and rightfully so, it is a problem. But then you're like, okay, where do we go next? And then it's really hard to imagine a world when you don't have like a model for it, right? That you can like kind of look back to and say, okay, well, this other thing had worked, or our data has shown that these things have been good, or whatever, right? And so this tension is something that I've been really, really struggling with. I'm new to this space, so that's probably a huge part of the reason why. But if you have any cheat sheets and answers, let me know. I'm really struggling.
No, this is the thing this keeps me out at night, actually, other than like my kid. But so this is really key, right? Because I was having a conversation with a student once, and we were trying to think about, well, what would utopia look like, right? Like no speculative fiction that we have right now. And speculative fiction is personally where I go to imagine, especially speculative fiction that's done, written by Black women, right? Like that's kind of my go-to. Octavia tried to tell us, I mean, that's a whole nother talk. But, Nedi Okaf, I'm gonna mispronounce her name. I hope she forgives me. Some of her work is, the one book I read recently was Who Fears Death? Oh, that is a beautiful book. Beautiful to think about, again, what could an Afrocentric future look like, or Afrofuturist work. Anyway, but this imagining question is really important, right? And I was talking to the student and we were trying to figure out, well, what would it look like to have utopia? Like, what would it look like if we were all equal? What would that feel like? What would be the bodily sensations that we would be experiencing? And what we came up with was silence. Because, conflict is kind of like part of the duality that we exist in, right? So now we were getting like super philosophical. But I think that concretely, the biggest thing for me is that when it comes to these kinds of systems, if the people who stand the most to lose by what you're building don't outnumber the people on your engineering team, you have a problem. If you don't know whom you're working with, if you've never met a mother whose parental rights have been terminated, if you've never met somebody who has aged out of the foster care system and asked them, well, tell me what that was like, and listen, then you don't know what you're doing. You can't know what you haven't experienced. So in other versions of this talk, I kind of go into this in more depth, but I removed it here, but I can send you a link if you want like that part of the talk. But you can't know what you haven't experienced. And marginalized communities have known this forever, right? Which is why we're always in community, because you can't see the back of your own neck, right? And so my advice is anybody who's building anything within a human service system, your team, the engineers and developers on your team must be outnumbered by people who have experienced the thing you are trying to prevent, and you must pay them in cash. If I see somebody else give a participant a gift card, I'm gonna flip over a table. Emphatically, right? Pay them cash and make them co-authors. It is their lives that is your data, right? You are trying to prevent what they went through. Their bodies have been put on the line for you. They're offering you pieces of them. Pay them. That's my concrete advice.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
Thank you, Maria. There are two questions as raised hands as well. So let's start with those as well. Michael, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Hello, Maria.
Hi, Michael.
Hope you're not sick of me.
Michael and I are good friends. I did not plant him in the
I have a question about like the title of the talk is based on that.
Yeah.
The limitations of moral philosophy. insofar as like helping deal with algorithmic bias. So I'm wondering, like what do you expect from moral philosophy when it comes to helping deal with this problem? And given that, what are the limitations? That didn't come across so clearly. So what are
Yeah,
the
no, thank you
limitations,
for that.
and
Yeah,
what do you expect from it? Because you may be expecting too much.
I might be. So thank you for that. So the limits are, and you're right, I didn't say it specifically. Moral philosophy, as we understand it today, was built by the same people that society was built for, right? That very specific intersection is who has spent the most of their time thinking about what is just and fair, and morally upright. That is changing, right? Thanks to people like Charles Mills, thanks to your friend Olufemi, thanks to a few others who have managed to infiltrate the political philosophy and moral philosophy space to bring in the perspectives of the margins, right? And I want to be clear that I use the term margins because quantitatively speaking, minority is not accurate, right? Like people of color have always outnumbered folks who are European, like since the beginning of time, or maybe not the beginning, but certainly recently. And so marginalized is really the term that I prefer. And so those are the limits, right? Is that we can't talk about fairness. We can't figure out what's fair from people who have built society for themselves, right? And so I don't expect them to, but I think the rest of the AI community, broadly defined, does expect them to, right? Because everybody who started thinking about fairness and justice was like, well, what do the moral philosophers say? And and that's great and well, and maybe a place to start, but the mainstream population isn't the one with the problem, right? That's not what we're seeing. And so so those are the limitations. Moral philosophy can't do anything for fairness and justice for marginalized people unless it is coming from a person of color who has bodily experience of what they're doing, in my opinion. I want to be clear about that. So yeah, hope that answers the question. Manuel?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for this whole talk. It was amazing, especially everything you're centering and the people you're centering and the sort. So yeah, amazing talk. And I think my question is similar to Radit's first question, except less about like, what can I do as an individual, and more some concern about kind of the macro size of it, of kind of like you were saying, that social work does have kind of a fraught history as well, that a lot of social work historically has been with police and a form of policing as well, detecting fraud and, ripping apart families because of gatekeeping and the sort. With kind of tech having a long history of co-opting justice things and kind of stripping away the parts that are really at the root and kind of towards justice, and keeping the parts that are more gatekeepy and policing, and just do you have any thoughts on how to have tech have more of a social work philosophy without it kind of taking just the gatekeepy policing parts and being able to say, look, now we are like social work, and now we have social work folks under our belt, and we're even less critiquable because look how much progress we're making.
Yeah.
Especially when, kind of like Radit was saying as well, there isn't models for it. And in fact, there's many incentives the other direction.
Yeah.
Where, academia is deeply segregated and deeply siloed off across disciplines. I don't see a lot of people doing the proofs wanting to start writing IRBs or like, so kind of long-term, do you see a way to get social work more in conversation with these fields in a way that doesn't just co-opt the language and just take the gatekeepy policing aspects of social work and leave the good critical work that is, yeah. Because
Yeah.
even within social work, just like there's lots of pushback against kind of the Black women pushing the field forward along justice fronts, and really kind of keeping a stronghold on a lot of the policing aspects of social work.
For sure. Yeah, 110,000%. Yeah, so I think that there are contingents. There's always resistance, right? There's always resistance, and that is something I've seen as, you know, I spent some time as a community organizer in North Philadelphia for a little while. And, you know, when I went to go get my PhD, I went to the University of Washington in Seattle. And my frankly anarchist friends were sort of like, well, why are you getting a PhD? Like, who's that gonna help? Yeah, who's that gonna help? And I said, you know, you're right. Like, you know, it's me joining a very specific system. But two things: one, people who come from where I come from don't get PhDs, and so I can offer some help in that way. You know, statistically, I'm not supposed to be sitting in front of you. And the second thing is that, do we need to burn it down? Maybe, but that's not my work. My work is holding the door open the way it was held open for me, so that I can bring in more people who are going to do their work, right? I'm not looking to make copycats of myself. I'm looking to support people who are also interested. Apparently we have to do dance party now, sorry. But you know, so that's my responsibility as I understand it, and my charge. And when I told them that, they were like, okay. And they made me a t-shirt that says, "The Analyzer, Distill and Convey." And they said, your job is to take really complex things, simplify them, and then tell everybody else. We'll hold you accountable for that. And so there's people that are doing that, right? But there's always resistance. And I think bringing in social workers is the first step, right? That may seem self-serving for somebody like myself to say, but it's why, you know, I'm on the Tutor Academic Advisory Board. It's why I'm like in part of, you know, Berkman Klein Centers at Harvard. And, you know, like, at the very least, I can my presence there, my picture on the website sends a particular kind of message, and though it's co-opted quite often, I can also use it for my ends, right? But the other thing is that I think in social work and I think in society at large, we're kind of at a decision point, right? We're trying to decide whether we want more of what we've had. MD4SG dance party, I'm down. As a society, as a world, frankly, we're trying to decide, like, do we want more of what we've had, or do we want something new, right? And that requires commitment. Long-term commitment. The reason people don't want to engage in social change is because it takes time. And I think capitalism has taught us this. In capitalism, there's something called the Holy Trinity: cost, quality, and time. And you can only have two. Right? So hopefully that offers some help. Logan, do you have a question as well? I don't know if it's okay that we're a little bit over.
Oh, we do have time. Yes, please go ahead.
Sure, thank you. And yeah, I'm Logan, nice to meet you. Thank you so much for your talk. This was really great. I am a PhD in computer science and like machine learning and stuff like this. And I've worked on fairness in the past, and I'm like getting more interested in child welfare and the criminal system and how these like crazy predictive models are used. So I'm curious about what you think about predictive models. The context that I'm coming in with is that in my work, I'm trying to do more human computer interaction, like social scientific research, trying to bring in more impacted stakeholders and just asking people what they think about these predictive tools used in child welfare. And it's really concerning to me because, like, as someone who works on these things from the whatever technical side, like, I don't think they're very good. And I think that they just like continuously get pushed down into the community without any feedback. And like within my work, like, it seems very simple. Just go out and like ask people who are actually affected what they think and try and do something like that, where you're trying to envision, what does utopia look like for you? What do you value? Is this aligning with that? But like a lot of my projects have been shut down, and like the departments just don't allow us to ask people about the technologies that they're just implementing, which is really crazy and upsetting. So I'm curious what you think about predictive tools in child welfare specifically.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I will say that, you know, I've given up on trying to figure out whether or not I'm going to get tenure, and decided that there's nothing I can do to control that. What I can do is my work, and maybe somebody's cool with it, maybe they're not. You know, the universe will provide. But you know, this is a really important issue, right? Because nobody wants to talk about, like, you know, the elephant in the room, so to speak, to use a phrase, right? And so I think that for me, what I've done to sort of deal with that is to say the truth, to say my truth as I understand it. I'll give you an example. I was asked early on in my career to spend some time at the New York City Administration for Children's Services, and to look at their predictive algorithms and evaluate them for racial equity. And I said, cool. What is the racial composition of the New York City Administration for Children's Services? And at the time, they didn't know. And I was like, so that seems like a problem. we should talk about that. But long story short, towards the end of that project, I said, well, listen, like, entry into the system isn't random. We can predict with a very simple linear regression with pretty high accuracy, which in statistics is simply your R squared. We can predict with really high accuracy who's going to walk in this door. We can predict with really high accuracy who's going to get a phone call to a child hotline. We know that information. So let's say we predict something. What's the intervention? What are we going to do? Once we predict it, okay, great, we've predicted it. What's the intervention? Nobody had an answer. I said, okay, well, since we know that entry into the system isn't random, methodologically, how can we impact that? Now, granted, this was years ago, so New York City ACS is in another place in case anybody's watching this recording. I don't know what y'all have been doing for the past 2 to 3 years. But at that time, I said, so the only way that I understand, with my understanding of, you know, statistics and mathematics to the best of my knowledge, the only way to deal with this, the fact that the entry into the system isn't random, is to introduce error. And the answer to that was absolutely not. And I was like, cool, well, I'll see you later. And I left. Because at a certain point, there's only so much of my integrity that I'm willing to compromise, right? And that was about the limit for me. So, you know, to me, my response, I should say, I don't want to tell a PhD student to do this, but for me, I'm happy to say no. I'm okay saying no. I'm okay walking away. That's a certain kind of, that's not because I have some kind of financial privilege or anything like that. It's because there's just a certain amount of stuff I'm not willing to do, right? I'm not willing to keep running in the same hamster wheel. So, you know, that might be one thing to do. And the other thing to do is to recognize that every place, every institution is constrained in some way, whether that's the academy, a nonprofit, a corporation, you know, Facebook, IBM, whoever, right? Everyone is under a certain amount of constraint. And so part of the calculus is, what do I think I can actually move forward here? where are the spaces, where are the cleavages where people are going to question me the least, that I can move forward in a specific way. In my doctoral program for my qualifying exam, literally my entire committee had no idea what I was doing. I was doing automated content analysis, and nobody in social work knew what I was talking about. And, and they were like, did you do it right? Like, we don't know. And I was like, here's the person who trained me. And it was a really wonderful man by the name of, oh my God, by the name of, and I quickly forget his name. I was a political scientist still at UW. Hopefully his name comes back to me. I hope he forgives me. And they're like, well, did you do it right? And he was like, yeah. And I was like, cool, I passed. Excellent. You know, but you know, so that again, that's how I dealt with it. So maybe that some of that might be helpful for you as you're navigating it. Yeah. Are there any other questions or thoughts?
There's a couple of questions in the chat
Oh.
as well, if I can read them. One from Liz Evans. How do we preserve ethics of care when capitalism looks to reduce cost per unit or employee, even more so with immigrant labor, in particular when there are policymakers, institutional leaders, or investors that believe non-European ancestry as discounted?
Mama. Give me a few moments, okay?
Okay, can I just tell you something first?
Yes, what is it?
Can
Okay.
so that's why I can't tell you right now or later.
Okay, I'll be done in 5 minutes. I'm watching the clock, okay?
Where?
Right here, when it says 2:15.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're
Could you repeat the question for me?
Yes, definitely. There's a question from Liz about how do we preserve ethics of care when capitalism looks to reduce cost per unit or employee, even more so with immigrant labor.
Yeah. So I think part of building the future we want to see is taking the risk we wish others would take. And so one of the things that I tell my students often is what I'd really love for all of you to do is to establish a cooperative mental health practice that is for profit, and the profit is for you. And I'm not saying that we need more corporations or more organizations necessarily, but what I am saying is that, again, every institution is constrained by things that you don't necessarily have power to address. So one of the things we think about a lot in social work is a SWOT analysis, right? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and challenges, right? And so if the challenges are such that you can't ethically function based on your values and principles, which hopefully you've outlined really clearly for yourself, and if you haven't, I encourage you to do so soon, then it may be that you need to imagine something different and begin to build it. Capitalism does what it was designed to do very, very well, which is create more stuff. That's its sole function, and it does it really well. It's why everybody has adopted it, because everybody has decided we need more stuff, and maybe we do. But I don't know that I think we will always be constrained under those particular rules. And so it may be that alternatives to organizations are in our best interest. I think I can take one more question before I have a mutiny.
Are there any other questions from the audience? If not, maybe I can ask a last question. And thank you so much, Maria, again, for everything. A question relates to this, to the previous one as well, is how can we think about policy related to all this work, and where how do we define like work that we should intervene on by like not creating more technological solutions, and where or which we like incentivize tech to help out or assist some human decision making. And yeah, how can we think about policy in this space? I know different places think about policy in completely different way, and wondering what's your take on it as well.
Yeah, for sure. So I spend maybe the majority of my time thinking about policy, right? And so I think that there's a lot of spaces where this is happening. The Center for Democracy and Technology has a lot of work around this, and sort of free events for people who might be interested, where they sort of collate, information and some of the stuff that's on the Hill right now, and, around AI and governance and so forth. But I think that the first thing is to recognize that you, as the technologist, as the coder, as the developer, as the software engineer, as the computer scientist, literally are the person with the power to impact production in the most ethical way possible, by asking yourself whether you have built trust with the end user of this product, right? You yourself, they're not going to listen to me, right? And at the most, they're going to invite me over for a talk, and then kind of move on. And check a box and say, hey, we did this one thing this one time, and now we're good, right? And so the ability, the power rests in you as the computer scientist, as a technologist, as a developer. So if you ask yourself, if you said, okay, well, who stands to lose the most by what I'm building? Do I know them? Where are they? Where are they? Literally in time and space, where are they? And do they trust me? If the answer is no, they don't trust you, stop. Am I asking you to do that at cost to yourself? Yes, I am. I need you to have skin in this game, right? So I need you to stop. If you say, no, they don't trust me, but I have time to build trust, and I have resources to build trust because I can pay them for their time. When I was a community organizer, we never asked anybody to come to a meeting that didn't have food and childcare and transportation money. Don't ask people for their time unless you're willing to pay them for it. And if you have time to build that trust, and you can do those three things, then build the trust and give them credit. And you'll see that whatever you end up building would be vastly more ethical than anything you could have come up with on your own. And if we were to treat policy in the same way, whether we're talking about organizational policy, or whether we're talking about national social policy, state policy, locality policy, you need to understand that the market values you, the computer scientist. The market doesn't value us. And if you're willing to use your power in this way, then we have a chance to move policy across all systems in the direction that we want it to go. But it does take you refusing to do something that you know to be incorrect. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk.
Thank you so much again. I'm sorry we're a little bit over time, but this has been incredibly insightful, and I think we all learned a lot from it. And thank you so much for making time for this. Thank you everyone for your questions and discussion. This has been the last MD4SG Colloquium for this year, but stay tuned for future events very soon, and we'll send out a recording of this talk as well.
Thanks all for your compassion with the interruptions. I appreciate it. Be well.
Thank you, Maria. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all. Bye.